I am Linda van Tilburg for NSN. The Army of the Republic of the Congo, or DRC, reported that it averted a coup against the government of President Felix Tshisekedi. At least 3 people were killed in the attacks in Kinshasa that they said include foreigners. And we have Daniel van Dalen, a senior country risk analyst at Signal Risk, who specializes in the DRC and the Great Lakes regions to help us understand what happened and what next. Hi, Daniel. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hello, thanks for having me. Yeah, the coup was quite an interesting one. It is probably the most bizarre story. It's probably one of the most bizarre stories and one of the most bizarre coups that I've probably seen in recent years across the continent. You know, you wake up at 5 a.m. on a Sunday and suddenly you're hearing about gunshots in the capital. And ultimately what happened was a group of around 20 gunmen approached the residence of former Deputy Prime Minister Vital Kamerhe. 2 police officers lost their lives in that confrontation, but they fortunately saved the Deputy Prime Minister. At the time, they were reportedly looking for the residence of the actual Prime Minister, which they didn't know, nor could they find. Then they made their way to the presidential palace, Palace of the Nation. It was empty at the time. Felix Tshisekedi was not there. And the leader of the group, an American Congolese by the name of Christian Malanga, raised the old Zaire flag and declared himself the president of the new Zaire. Within about 10-20 minutes later, the presidential guard responded, the military responded, Malanga and a couple of the other gunmen were killed in exchange gunfire, and effectively the rest of the group were captured within about an hour or 2 afterwards. So basically, by the evening of the 19th of May, the government had put out a statement saying everything had been contained and everything was basically fine.
So, well, you talked about this one person that was behind it. But they've also said that there are foreigners behind. They mentioned Americans and one Briton.
Yeah. So Christian Malanga his family fled the DRC in the early 90s. He was born in 1986, and obviously with all the wars in the Congo, he left. And eventually his family ended up in the United States, where he was educated. He went back to the DRC in the early 2000s, joined the military, started a couple of successful businesses there. And at one stage, around 2009, 2010, he sought to basically enter DRC politics, did not get very far. And in 2010, he was accused of plotting the overthrow of Kabila at the time. He then fled the country and basically went back to the US, started a new political party that was meant to represent the diaspora of the DRC. Zero presence in the DRC itself, although there are a couple of what I can only imagine I've seen them. There are a few shell companies that are linked to some old mining contracts, but they never went anywhere. So he's obviously had, perhaps a business presence in the DRC, but for the rest, he made his money through export-import operations around the world. There are a couple of companies that are registered in the US. He's also involved in a couple of mining projects in Mozambique. So he's a very mysterious guy with a lot of hubris, it seems. If you look at his social media, he has his own website about what he wanted to accomplish as DRC's new president. So he is originally Congolese and got his American citizenship after living there. So the foreign nationals that are being spoken about now, one is his son, who's been captured. The Briton national, that is still under dispute. So I haven't physically seen those passport photos. I have a few people that I've reached out to in the DRC. They've confirmed the American passports, but not the British ones. And there is definitely a Canadian passport somewhere there as well. But then that Canadian passport and the other US passport is potentially linked to a business associate of Malanga and a cannabis entrepreneur based in the States that was actually caught drug trafficking between Canada and the US like 15 years ago. So these are the people that tried to take over the DRC government. And this is why I say it is the most bizarre coup, where you have a man who has always sought to become president through these types of means, made an extensive amount of money, brought his son and his business associate with a couple of hired guns from the DRC, and then decided to try and take over. So it really is bizarre, and I think we're still waiting for a lot of things to come out of the investigation and interviews from those who are captured. I think especially Malanga's son and the business associate. So yeah, we're definitely waiting for that information. Hopefully we can get a bit more from that.
I see in the US, Malanga's son, this friend of his family says no, he's been at the wrong place at the wrong time or something like that.
That is somewhat unlikely. They've gotten all of the subsequent investigations have found exactly where they were staying before, entry, all that kind of stuff. So it's very unlikely that it's a wrong place, wrong time, because he was effectively caught in, military fatigues, bulletproof vest, and a gun with American flag patches on his vest. So it's highly unlikely that it's the wrong place, wrong time. I think also the fact of the matter is, videos were uploaded on social media months, weeks before, and even a day before they live streamed the coup on Facebook. They were all seen there, guns, well, not guns blazing because they didn't have to. But yeah, they were all seen there. He's in the videos, so physically cannot be wrong time, wrong place. He was there with Malanga to support whatever he was doing, perhaps under the guise that it would be easier or some sort of dream sold by Malanga as opposed to the reality on the ground.
Well, for people who might not know the DRC so well, it is an enormous African country. It is so large. And can you give us a little bit of background about the DRC and why Western audiences, why it matters to Western audiences that we take, note of these coups?
So in the DRC has had a very long, precarious history. It has been the host of what I've previously described as Africa's World War, which was the Congo Wars, which spread over the 90s to the early 2000s. And, Kabila, during that time, Kabila rose to power. We've seen that under his administration in the 2000s, it was an erosion of governments, an erosion of institutions in what is probably one of the most important mineral countries in the world. And unfortunately, that has really set the country back. And also it has allowed, and from the Western standpoint, it is through Kabila's kind of network of patronage, a lot of this has allowed China to come in and dominate the global mineral market, especially in terms of, green minerals that are used for these kind of new generation technologies. So why this matters now, especially, is the fact is we haven't had a coup attempt since. So this would kind of be the first one since all of these, the Congo Wars and these rebellions and that kind of thing. And why it's important now is that you have a president that has shown an inclination to be more pro-West, who is willing to work with the US specifically. And this has come with a lot of advantages. We've seen IMF programs, all the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank. There's a lot more money flowing into the DRC for investment. The US is now big invest in the Libido trade corridor, which will run from Zambia, DRC, Angola. And then obviously the big purpose of that is to make sure that the US has a better supply line of these minerals to now start competing with China. So rhetoric by US officials in the DRC are often, we understand your relationship with China, but we can help you better. We'll provide, better investment than they have done previously. And that's really been the crux of it is, China has been involved in the DRC and they've promised all of these things, but nothing's ever materialized. So, I'm not saying that Tshisekedi is completely pro-West, but he balances that relationship quite well. And I think that's why it's so important is that you have a president that is moving the country forward, and as electric vehicle batteries and all of these things become more and more prominent as the world goes more green and sustainable and that kind of stuff, Congo is going to emerge as, an even more important country than it has previously been. There are vast taps of minerals that are untapped. It is going to emerge as an effective geopolitical battleground as more and more countries start to see, how can we take advantage of this? What is the best interest for us and the Congo? And that's why I think Tshisekedi has done it correct, is they say, well, you can come in, but now it's about what benefit are we getting? So it's no longer the case of, well, you can just have our mines. You can have our mines, but then you have to build a refinery. You have to build power plants. You have to do this. And that is, doing quite well. So I think the risk was that if a coup happened, you would see all of this development reverse. And equally, there are also obviously, repercussions for regional stability as well. If we saw, a breakout and a civil war in the DRC, there would be repercussions for things like Rwanda, Burundi, Uganda, all of those things as well. From a trade perspective, from global supply chains, specifically China as well. But if there was a civil war there would be a huge downturn in the export of those critical minerals, copper, cobalt. Lithium is a new thing that the Congo is now developing as well. So I think that's why it's so important, and the DRC will become more important, I think, over the next decade.
Well, can we turn to the SADC military force that's also in the DRC, that is what's saying they're helping to resist the rebel attacks of the M23 rebels? Do you expect them to make any progress more than their East African counterparts did?
So it's an interesting question, because the East African regional force came in with a very different mandate than the SADC. So the East African force came in saying, well, we're here to serve as a buffer between M23 and the Congolese military. So you don't fight. That's it. While we try and maybe sort this out diplomatically, we are going to be here to kind of occupy spaces. But that didn't work out at all. M23 continued to fight. They continued to expand. When it came down to it, the East African Community Force refused to engage, even when there were clear violations. And obviously this fundamentally comes down to the fact that there are documented cases of Rwandan soldiers in the middle of M23 supplying them, so there's obviously been a lot of apprehension in that sense. Out of all of them, only really Burundi was willing to step up, and that's why Burundi actually went off and did their own thing, which was not necessarily welcomed internationally, but they did make a couple of some progress. But eventually, we saw too many violations. East African force got kicked out. SADC came in, but SADC came in with a mandate that was an active offensive mandate, not just a defensive one. So, but what's funny is, who are the supporting actors in the SADC? They are the same countries that basically kicked out M23 under the MONUSCO Forced Intervention Brigade in 2012. Malawi, Tanzania, and South Africa. They were all the key contributors to that offensive force of MONUSCO. And it's the same guys that are coming back now to do it again. So I think the intention is pure. I think there really is an intention to ensure that, one, Goma remains safe. We have seen an encroachment of that by M23, mortar strikes increasingly around the city. They have positioned themselves, to the east of the city in this strategic town called Sok, however you pronounce it. And they have done well to defend that. Absolutely. That cannot be denied. However, M23 has a lot of resources, it has a lot of manpower, and what is currently being contributed by SADC is not enough. Especially when you have a Congolese military that is so under-resourced, under-capable in a lot of areas. There have been tons of reforms recently, positive reforms, and I think that partial embargo on arms to the DRC, which not necessarily embargo, but a reporting system, that got lifted 2 years ago, and ever since then, we've seen a huge influx of more advanced weaponry, drones, to the benefit of the Congolese military. So I think it's getting there. But at present, you also have a SADC force that is just under-resourced. There have been myriad articles written in South Africa about how, South African National Defense Force, which is the biggest contributor and the biggest funder of the operation, doesn't actually have the resources. You don't have the mechanized equipment. It's just not there. Where in 2012 with the FIB, you had the gunships, you had the weapons, you had everything you needed, where now that's not there. So I think SADC will do the job in terms of defending the key diplomatic assets, the key, they'll defend Goma, they'll defend SADC, and they'll prevent that advance from coming. But in terms of actively kicking M23 out, I don't think they're going to have that much of an impact. That will ultimately come down to whether the Congolese military and their aligned militias can move forward. We have seen a couple of battleground successes, especially in Rutshuru territory in the past couple of weeks, where they've regained, it's about 10 villages, which is kind of like the first positive things we've seen out of that since a huge advance by M23 over the past couple of months. I am a little bit optimistic, especially now that we're seeing Chinese drones coming in. DRC is getting, their fighter jets are becoming more and more operational. So I think it's not necessarily SADC will save the day, SADC will defend the core interests in North Kivu province, Goma, but that will then free up resources for the Congolese military to direct that elsewhere, as opposed to saying, well, we have to put all of our manpower here, but we can now send it somewhere else.
But there's also the issue of South Africa that has a complicated relationship with Rwanda. So explain what's going on there.
So it is, so Rwanda has, if you believe everything, which, Rwanda has carried out at least 3 assassinations of their political figures in South Africa. South Africa has also refused to investigate several genocide suspects from the Rwandan genocide, and that has created quite a bit of tension between the two countries over the years. South Africa is also one of the few countries that has not, again, we saw it with the Forced Intervention Brigade in 2012, and we've seen it now. The fact is that there are Tanzania and Malawi, are the only ones that are willing to say, well, we're going to fight. We don't care. And I think that, while not necessarily good for relations broadly, I think it is positive for the DRC that the SADC force could go in, where they said, well, we're willing to stand up to Rwanda, with the EAC perhaps less so. It's obviously a bit more complicated when it's your neighbor, trade, regional stability. You're worried about all of those things. South Africa, not as worried. And again, I think it's also indicative of that Tanzania didn't join the East African Regional Force, but they've joined the SADC one. So again, it just speaks to, those relationships. And while it's not necessarily the best relationship, those relationships are the things that are allowing them to effectively fight M23. But because Rwanda is not officially in, the DRC, I don't think you're going to see any erosion of relations because of what SADC is doing. Obviously, Rwanda has had a big huff and a puff about, SADC going in is going to undermine regional stability, but that's obviously just because obviously they were worried. We also saw when SADC went in, suddenly massive movements of manpads from Rwanda, surface-to-air missiles, those things were being transported across the border the minute SADC came. But again, I just think it's more the case of those relationships allowed SADC to go in where, we're not best of friends. So we're very happy to send this in. But again, I think it's a case of what Rwanda can always do is we're not there officially. So this doesn't necessarily mean anything for us between, Malawi, Tanzania, and South Africa.
Well, Daniel van Dalen, thanks so much for your insights.
Yeah, thank you for having me.